Sons of Devils by Alex R. Oliver, Chapter 13. At sea off Istanbul, 1742. Alaya's little hand found Ecaterina's wrist and pushed in so hard the bones creaked against each other. The sword dropped from her numb hand. Her head was wrenched to the side, fire along her backbone at the twist, the gritty sound of vertebrae trying to move further than they could. And still Vacarescu had not fallen, though he was panting, supporting himself on the table with one hand, while the other pressed on the wound where she had stabbed him. Blood ran over his fingers and splashed on the floor with a tiny little tink of a noise. It was enough to make the moment explode. The watching Strigoi groaned and surged forward. The white Strigoi, Constantin, materialized out of the darkness and threw out a commanding hand. "No!" And they stopped, held, all their eyes fixed on the red rain, swaying back and forth in little thwarted movements to the time of the beat of a heart. Then the doctor clapped a pad of white material over the wound, and Frank threw off the restraining arm of a familiar-looking red-haired valet to lay his hands on either side of the laceration. Using a chant Ecaterina had taught him herself, the traitor, he closed the wound and sealed it over. The bleeding stopped. No! No! She was owed vengeance, damn it! If this was to be her last chance, how could it fail? Where was the justice in that? Vacarescu straightened up, still breathing hard. He looked at her with no understanding at all in his clear grey eyes. Why? "You bastard! It's because of you. My brother is dead. I'm going to kill you even if I have to come back from my grave to do it. I'm going to kill you for Stefan's sake." She wouldn't cry. She refused. She would not die weeping. She was better than that. But her face was wet when she felt the cold mouth descend on her throat. She screwed her eyes more firmly shut so she would not see their pity and disgust while the creature fed on her. "Wait!" Vacarescu's voice, surprisingly. He was not the one she would have expected to protest. "Mother, wait! Please!" Constantin replied, a faint shake in his firm tones. "We gave you Frank. How many more are you going to ask for? Are we to be always under your thumb?" Just this one, Father. If you spare her, I will marry her. I will marry her. You will have the heir I've denied you." "What?" Ecaterina kicked at Alaya's legs, but only got her boots entangled in the myriad folds of silk. What felt like the tips of two slightly rusty needles grazed along her skin, but did not break it. Then the maiden put her down carefully on her feet, and regally circumnavigated her. "She will not bring much beauty to our line, but she has class and fire, she might do. I think at this stage we can't afford to be too choosy." Now that nobody was bleeding, their circle of predators had begun to lose interest and drift away. Constantin's voice was smooth and strong again. "What do you say, girl? Is it a bargain?" She was tempted to spit in his face, but Ecaterina prided herself on her practicality. If she said no, they would kill her. If she said yes, she could marry Vacarescu, kill him later in safety, and take his lands as Stefan's blood price. She could endow that school of magic Bucharest so sorely needed with the proceeds. There was clearly only one right choice. "It is." "Wonderful. Welcome to the family." Constantin bowed with the graciousness of an earlier century. "This is my wife, Alaya." He indicated the creature that had nearly supped on Ecaterina's blood. "You may call her mother. You may call me Sir." He turned to the doctor. "Your captain can perform marriages, am I right?" The doctor had spent most of this conversation looking between the bloody bandages in his hand and Vacarescu's unscarred side. Now he lifted a medical alembic full of liquid out of one of his chests, poured himself a large dose, and knocked it back. He still had to try twice before he could force his shaking hands to set the measure carefully on the table. The first time he had missed. He said, and risked a haunted glance out at the darkness of the hold, visible now his office walls lay slashed to pieces around him. Not real ones. The captain has power on board this ship, so it will be a marriage on board, but it wouldn't hold once you stepped ashore. A lot of young women get fooled by that. Good. So here was a way to stave it off, perhaps until the end of the war, and she might make many further attempts to kill him before that came to pass. My father and his household are in the ship following this. She straightened with as much haughtiness as her boy's clothes allowed. He will not be pleased if it isn't done properly. Besides, I am a Boyarishna. I am entitled to all the ceremony that implies. I won't have my wedding be some shamefaced backdoor affair, as though I had something to be ashamed of. The red-haired valet had disappeared as soon as the ring of Strigoi had broken up enough to allow him to pass. Now he returned with a fresh shirt and waistcoat in his arms. Once Vacarescu had changed and stuffed the blood-soaked garments in a pail of salt water, a tension she hadn't been quite aware of went out of both of the elder Strigoi. Something wolf-like in their faces eased and left them looking almost human. What? The doctor chased his dose of green liquid with a large beaker of what smelled like gin. He was a young man, but he had the rosy-veined nose, waxy bags under his eyes, and pallid, clammy skin of a perpetual alcoholic. What exactly just happened? He pointed the index finger of his drinking hand at Elia, the gin sloshing at the movement. What were you going to do with... He squinted at Ecaterina doubtfully, taking in her mannish clothes, her blotchy, horsey face, putting them together with the talk of marriage. Her? Vacarescu looked at her, waiting, as if he knew this was her chance to denounce him. But really, if she was going to do that, and she was not entirely sure that she was, the plan to give Wallach's monsters to the Ottomans was one she approved. If she was going to denounce him, she would choose a better audience than this unimportant sot. I have no idea what you mean, she said coolly. I think you should go easier on the gin if you have begun seeing things you cannot believe. How alike they all looked, Vacarescu and his monsters, with that little smile of grudging approval. Indeed. Perhaps we should take this somewhere more private. As they trooped up the ladders, past the now warm galley fire, and shut themselves in the back room at the back of the ship, Ecaterina noticed that Vacarescu and Frank walked close together. Frank would keep glancing at him, would keep reaching out and giving him little concerned touches that the other man did not reject. Vacarescu's face was as closed as it ever was, a mask shaped out of steel, but Frank looked as shaken as any man who had nearly seen his lover killed in front of him. They closed the door behind them, sat down in a long, narrow room, where a table set with coarse linen hung from ropes attached to the deck above, and the folding seats had barely room to fit between the board and the lines of tiny cell-like cabins on either side. Watching Frank fuss, it occurred to her that Vacarescu had saved her life. He no more wanted to marry her than she wanted to marry him, but he had made the offer rather than see her die. It made her feel sick, because it poured at her certainty. If she owed him her life, did that cancel out the death she owed him for Stefan? Or did bringing her into peril in the first place only compound his guilt? I should turn around and take you home, he was saying now, playing at responsible manhood, while his left hand beneath the table lay possessively on Frank's knee. I can't take you into a war. You're taking her. She hoped she had this right, that the red-headed lad she pointed at really was Mirella, and not simply the original of Mirella's disguise. When the boy smiled and Vacarescu gave a snort of laughter, she knew she had guessed correctly. She is magically equipped to take care of herself. Frank narrowed his eyes at that, leaned forward as if he could feel the blue-white glow of Ecaterina's power like a flame on his skin. Ecaterina can too. It's come back then, your glamour. You don't look different, but you feel... I have it under control now, she boasted, proud to have achieved something that he with his many talents could not do. Reaching out, she plucked the second strand, watched all the expressions around the table, except for her fiancé's, go slack with awe. Then she released it and let her false beauty lie dormant again, only bolstering the likability to compensate. I still see nothing. Vacarescu looked at his companions with sceptical eyes, and then more carefully back at her. Except that you're wearing César's coat, and he would not have given it to you lightly. People want to help me, Ecaterina explained lightly. It's an underestimated power, but a real one. Vacarescu thought for a long moment, as the room swayed around them and feet thundered over the deck above. Voices and the rattle and gush of pumps echoed up from below. He checked his pocket watch. Almost dawn, and sighed. Very well, then. I don't want to risk taking an army of Strigoi back home when we so barely missed disaster last time. They're hungry, and wherever we put into port now, I expect they will stream off the ship and never be persuaded back. Better to carry on, and make sure that happens in Istanbul and not before. He turned to the one he called his father. And was that the truth? Could it be? Could familial love survive even death? Had she been wrong to see only the eyes of a demon looking back at her from the face of her brother? Can you hold back your fledglings from feeding on the sailors for the week it will take to get to Istanbul? We can hold them from killing, Constantine replied carefully. And how ugly it was that they still felt able to make such nice distinctions, as though between life and death was as small a difference as between linen and silk. But if they are allowed to feed a little, it will make the crew more susceptible to doing my will. And you can have them hold offshore long enough to arrive in the night time. Exactly. The reason for this precaution became all too clear as they disembarked at the muster station in Prosphorian harbour. They had indeed been able to delay sailing into the harbour until late evening, and now slipped quietly through shoals of other craft, gusted along only by the smallest, highest sails. There was barely a bulge of water by the bow, and the sailors could lean out from the bowsprit nets and fend aside any moored craft that drifted into their path. Ecaterina stood on deck, now in her own coat. She had returned César's with thanks, and received his commiseration on her failure to kill Constantine, with what she hoped looked like stoic resignation, and not the indifference that it was. Around her the ship's company worked in dazed silence, lowering the longboats over the side, filling them with the Strigoi, and ferrying them over to the shore. She sat in the last boat, crammed up against Constantine's cold legs, feeling the chill and the odd plasticity of them against her own knee. She expected an outcry from the shore, where hasty tented barracks had been set up, and already encampments of soldiers were huddled around their fires, picking their teeth from supper. There was no outcry, only laughter from one fire and the sounds of a quarrel from another. As the Strigoi drew themselves up into rough ranks, like a company of foot soldiers under Vacarescu's command, a young man wandered over from the closest encampment. She recognised Ion Petrescu, whose father had claimed the gout and sent his son with their levy. He had the shiny, eager face of a man who is determined to rise to a challenge and simultaneously terrified of failing. The stress had brought him out in a rash of acne beneath his soft boy's beard. "I've brought my troops," Vacarescu indicated the Strigoi with a convincingly nonchalant hand. "Where do I go to report in?" "Troops are being counted and assigned barracks and commanders by the harbour master." Eon tugged his sash tight over the barrels of his pistols and gave a self-important sigh, as though he was far too busy for this. He pointed. "You go in and report there, and he'll sort it out. But he'll be in bed by now. Why don't you men come over and bunk with mine for tonight? You can sort it out in the morning." The ship's boats had finished landing personnel. Now they began hauling the long, empty boxes that must be serving as the chief Strigoi's coffins up onto the docks. Constantine and Elia looked nervously between the boxes and the eastern horizon. Disembarkation had taken longer than anyone hoped. What would happen, Ecaterina wondered, if they were caught out here when the sun rose? Would they turn to dust? Burst into flame? She would quite like to see that. "I will have my men seen and recorded now." Vacarescu tried for noble arrogance, but only succeeded in conveying a glimpse of a dangerous temper. "If I am awake and managing troops at this time of night, I see no reason why some Turk with no drop of noble blood should sleep. Catiline?" Ecaterina was examining the hills on either side of the anchorage, dark bulks dotted over with the light of lanterns and torches. White buildings glimmering pallid and half seen as clouds, reflecting the moonlight from the sea. "Catiline!" She jumped, as the name snapped back into her mind like the flick of a whip. Oh, that was her! She had given César that name. He must have told it to Vacarescu at some point on the long dreary voyage. But what could he want with her? She was his bride, and then executioner, not his lackey. "My lord?" "You will go and find this harbour official. Have him come here and sign us off. I am—" He shouldered aside the helpful young man, barged through the knot of Frank of Mirella and his parents, and grabbed her hard by the upper arm. His fingers dug in, leaving bruises, and she was taken aback by the combination of outrage and tears that threatened in response. No one laid a hand on a boyar's daughter in such a way. She almost told him so, bit it back as he leaned in, and the expression on his face could be read, night shadow or not. It wasn't anger at all, it was fear. It tripped her own fury up, made her stop and think. No one laid a hand on Ecaterina Starescu like this. But Catiline, on the other hand, had probably spent every moment of his young manhood brawling. He would not bruise at a handprint. He would shrug off a broken bone like a hangnail. The wind was warm over the calm water. The streets smelled of cardamom, rosewater and donkeys. There might be Wallachian and Moldavian troops camped around them, but beyond that shelter there were janissaries and spies who would all want to know why she was dressed up as a soldier and yet demanding a woman's rights. Time to toughen up. She sniffed back tears and fury, let him shake her a little, punctuating his low, private words. "We need the Turks to accept I have brought the army I owe them. Do you want to be standing still here when the sun rises and the Strigoi show what they are? Do you think the Turks will be merciful to you when they find out what we've done? We cannot have them find out. You charmed César into parting with his wife's coat. If you can do that, you can rouse a reluctant bureaucrat from his slumber and have him thank you for dragging him here. It will look efficient of him to inspect and dispose of us the same night that we arrive. But if you want to wait until he can come in the morning, you can think of a reason why our army cannot be seen in sunlight. It had better be a good one, because you'll be repeating it in the Fortress of 7 Towers for all the Sultan's best torturers." There had been some reluctance in her mind over the idea of killing him, some gratitude left over from the way he had been the only one still to be talking to her once she lost her glamour. this dispelled it. If he ended up in the Fortress of Seven Towers, it would be no more than he deserved. But she had no desire to be there with him. I'll go, but I don't speak Turkish. Frank put his long hand sympathetically atop Vacarescu's on her arm, made him drop her. I do. I'll be your dragoman. Come on. Frank, Ecaterina noticed, had a sudden likeability of his own. She wasn't sure if it was her glamour or his androgynous beauty that got them past the guards at the door of the harbour master's house. Both, perhaps. Inside they were deposited in a long, narrow room, empty of anything at all, except for a few cushions under the star-pierced shutters of the long window, while one of the guards went to see if he was awake. "Will your power work through a messenger?" Frank whispered, watching him go, the servant's light revealing scuff marks from tables on the floor, drips of wax and tiny dunes of ink-drying powder. "No," she whispered back. "I don't think so, and I don't think we have long to wait." Perhaps a sincere apology and an "I'm sorry, but we're ignorant foreigners and don't know any better" would work. Better than whatever would come of 100 panicking Strigoi left to follow their instincts at sunrise. So they followed the guard out of the waiting room, deep into the house, past wary slaves and alcoves, and across floors where well-dressed men lay sprawled in sleep, as though cut down where they stood. Did no one possess a bed in Istanbul? At last, she was breathing so hard she felt sure she had been walking for 4 nights running. The guard passed into a smaller chamber, and bent down to shake a heavy man by his peacock-blue collar. Ecaterina closed her eyes, poured all the strength she had into fire. "I am ever such a nice person, you badly want to please me," and stepped out from behind the guard, to launch into her spiel of mingled pleading and apology. "I'm so sorry. My lord is so rude to do this to you, but he will whip me if I don't bring you. Please come." It worked, even with Frank having to translate the meaning of her words. But by the time the harbour master had washed and replaced sleeping clothes with day clothes, it was less late at night than very early in the morning. Time nipped at her heels like an angry terrier as they hurried down to the docks. She walked into gazes like broken glass, Vacarescu very rigid with his chin up and his back straight, and a muscle jumping at the side of his jaw. Constantine looking paler than ever, his skin almost matching his snowy garments. Even his eyes were the colour of ice. She half expected him to dissolve into cloud and blow away on the wind. Alaya, conspicuous in her court finery, had already disappeared, taken her over-prettiness to find a burial place somewhere or an early victim before the sun, which already lit the tips of the distant minarets a blush pink, swung over the hills and hit her in the face. The army of fledglings were having a hard time passing as human in dawn's broadening light. There was something rat-like about their faces, their stiff skin stuck as if by glue onto fleshless bones. She felt the inspector quail at the sight of them when he walked down the final rank, noted their number in his book. She could see them twitching as they had done in the hold, their bloodlust held back by Constantine's will. The inspector had Vacarescu make his mark next to the tally. The fledglings were hissing now behind her, as streaks of sunlight began to touch the flat roofs and gild the topmost trees in the many rooftop gardens. "I will be living here with my household." Vacarescu used that same grip on the inspector, the one that had left her with bruises. He turned the man round by force and led him to one of the lodging-houses that lined the quay. Ecaterina followed, as behind her a chittering noise broke out. A sudden gust of wind came, and then silence. Ecaterina could see from the side of her eye some of the Strigoi clambering into such ships as were moored close, as if to burrow back into the dark gravel of their ballast. The greater part of them turned into an ashy fog and whisked up the hill to curl around Mohammedan gravestones, and to sink there into refuge, just as the sun crested the hill and poured down over Ecaterina's tired face. Out on the bay, in a single-person rowing boat, there came a noise, and a burst of oily backfire. The boat burned bright for a moment, then folded in half and capsized, something dark falling from the centre of it, and sinking in rapidly clearing water. From every direction all at once came the call of the muezzin, earthy as musk and cumin, eerie as the sun. "You will come and take tea." The inspector noted down the address and shook his head. "I will go to morning prayers and then return to my own home." He turned, and the parade ground where once Vacarescu's army had stood was altogether empty, except for a yellow dog sniffing at a fallen hat. "Where did they go?" "They have gone to set up their barracks." Vacarescu smiled a slightly shaky smile. "No sense in wasting time." "Your zeal is remarkable." The harbour-master closed up the many leaves of his brass-bound notebook. "But perhaps it could be toned down in future. Allah gives us enough time to do the things that he gives us to do, including sleep. It is unnecessary to try and make more of it." "I shall remember that." Vacarescu bowed the Turk away, watching until he was swallowed up in the entrance of one of the side streets, leading up to a modest grey mosque. Looking around after, determining that no one was watching, he slumped from proud certainty to dogged relief. He covered his face with both hands, shoulders hunched, until Ecaterina reached out and pinched him hard in the inside of his elbow, because he deserved to have bruises that matched hers. "What?" "We made it," she said. Radu, Frank and she huddled together, enmities subsumed in relief. Mirella, if it was still Mirella under there, grinned at them a couple of paces back from the group, but did not attempt to come closer. On the other side of the square, early risers in the army camps began to wriggle out of their tents and rekindle the campfires that had been glowing sullenly at dawn. "We did," Radu nodded. "And we are among the first to arrive. There's Volpes, Tatarescu, Moriaru and Gusa still to come. The harbour officials will be busy today, and after tonight they'll be preoccupied." "Then we can afford to rest." Frank looped an arm through Mirella's arm and pulled her in too. After a few seconds more spent breathing and relaxing, one peril behind them, they followed him into the lodging-house Radu had picked out. This was a 3-story building, whose landlady haggled with Frank from behind a screen, nothing more than a voice and glimpses of black cloth. 2 rooms. Ecaterina was gestured in to sleep beside Mirella, and though it was no more than what she would have preferred, she still found the lack of enthusiasm for her company somewhat insulting from a future husband. The first part of the plan was over and successful. They might survive this after all, in which case the stabbing had been both unsuccessful and too public. Stefan would surely not mind a quieter way, something more subtle. She looked at Mirella with fascinated curiosity as the girl slid effortlessly into her own appearance and claimed the stack of cushions underneath the window. The Roma were rumoured to kill cattle without leaving the slightest evidence of how it was done. "What do you know about poisons?" she asked. Chapter 14, in which Zayd's flying carpet problem once more becomes relevant. A little pile of white arsenic twisted into a cone of paper. It sat on the carpet between Zayd, his mother, and his Auntie Jala, and seemed to take the lamplight of the room into itself, the night's darkness pressing in all around it. "I want us all to have enough," Zayd untwisted it and poured it into the dish of his best brass scales. Then he scraped it into thirds and wrapped each third individually, giving each woman their own and taking one for himself, which he pushed into his sash. The Sultan, may he live forever, has promised torment not only for myself but also for you if I cannot bring him magic carpets. Though I am reluctant to disappoint him in anything, if we must die, I would rather know that you two had gone peacefully." "It will not come to that," said his mother. But she took the poison and tucked it into her own clothes. "How goes the search for mages?" Zayd felt as sick as if he had swallowed down the powder already. He packed the scales back into their lacquered box and set it by the wall. "Badly. I begin to suspect that a man who could enchant a carpet to fly might be born so rarely there would be only one in the world at one time. How am I to find such a one in 2 weeks? I don't wish to worry you, but I think it would be a good time for both of you to make your wills and settle our accounts in preparation for death. We will go to the mosque together tomorrow and make ready." Aunt Jalla held her little packet of poison reluctantly, as if it burnt her hand. Then she tucked it into a box on the shelf by the window that opened into the mausoleum's little internal courtyard, for it was a palace of a place, as was only fitting for such an holy inhabitant. Dede Abdul had his own garden, which Jalla kept tidy for him, and if she grew marrows in the flower beds and peaches up the walls, the saint had yet to object. She went over to uncover a bowl of roughly chopped fruit, scattered with star anise and cinnamon. This she brought back to set between them on a tiny table, whose feet covered the place where the scales had lain. "I will do as you asked." She offered Zayd the food with a resolute look. "But until the guards are at the door, I will carry on living with all the hope and enjoyment I can muster. Come, eat your supper, and then we'll sleep to rise in strength tomorrow. Eat." He had just taken a piece of melon, pink as a sunset, that smelled of honey and water, when there came the sound of stones shifting outside in the dark. Someone stumbled amid the graves. A sliding sound of granite against granite, slow at first and then speeding, and a thud that shook the ground beneath them. Zayd's despair gave way gratefully to disbelief and then fury. It sounded as though someone was taking the coverstones off the tombs, opening up the graves. But surely that was inconceivable. Who would do something so blasphemous, and without even the attempt to keep it quiet or conceal it? "What is this?" his mother asked, her head tilted and listening. "Grave robbers? Anatomists? The stones are moving, but I hear no footsteps." Something fluttered at the window, a blackness eclipsing the view of the stars. But it was the inner window, that opened only on a space enclosed everywhere by high walls. No one would have climbed over and dropped into the private garden when they could simply come to the door and be welcomed. Surely. Zayd had no sooner thought it than someone scratched at the front door. Long, odd-sounding scratches, as though made by stone knives. A cold breeze floated in from the window, as though it snowed, except that snow would have felt pure, and this did not. Normally Zayd would have stepped through to the main room to open the door and welcome a guest with tea and hospitality. Now he paused, as both women reached out to stop him rising. "Don't. Wait." His mother went to her writing desk and slipped a potent diagram from its leather case. Folding it up and rolling it, she threaded it into a clay bead and hung it around his neck. "There. Now you may go." Patting his arm reassuringly, she smiled as the scratching came again. But he noticed she had given another copy of the paper to Jalla, and was uncapping her inkwell already to put the finishing touches to a third. "I'm sorry, I'm coming," Zayd called out, as the scratching became a knock that made the door judder in its frame. He wanted to think he was being ridiculous, How could he fear any traveller destitute enough to need shelter here? But when he took his lantern out to the great room of the catafalque and saw the heavy stone door fluttering like a carpet at the blows, his courage ebbed away. He retained enough of it to lift the latch and ease the door open a crack, to peer out, not to drop his lantern at the sight of the thing that waited outside. Its skin was white as salt, its eyes blue like a cat's. There was something very wrong with the shape of its mouth beneath its bloodless lips. They parted, and he saw teeth like bone needles, those blue eyes staring as if they had been painted on. The words of hospitality dried up in his mouth. Now I know what the evil eye truly looks like, he thought, and he would never mistake anything human for it again. His bowels cramped as fear tried to turn his insides into water. The creature said something, hissing and whispering in a voice that had to be dredged out unwilling from a chest that didn't move. He didn't understand the words, but he was hit like a blow with the urge to open the door wide and invite it in. No. He didn't want to do that. His flesh shrank from the thought. Yet at the same time he took a step forward, his body traitor to his will, the urge to obey outside him, beating against him, his own mind screaming denial inside his skin, trapped, powerless. He opened his mouth, the words, "Please come in," trapped on the tip of his tongue. He stretched out a hand to push the door wider, and with a supreme effort called it back again, the gesture unmade. Perhaps it was the potency of the magic square, perhaps Allah's intervention, but his hand, recoiling, struck the bead that lay around his neck and clamped there. Cool freedom pushed up through the palm, up his arm, into his head, like the opposite of a burn. "You are not welcome here!" He slammed the door in the demon's face, just as someone screamed in the harem, "Zayd! Zayd, help!" He had never run so fast, was briefly impressed with his own speed before the sight of Jalla physically struggling to hold his mother back from opening the window dashed all other thoughts from his mind. His mother's protective square lay still incomplete on the desk. She opened her mouth. He threw both hands around her, one to silence any words of invitation, the other to grab her wrist and force her fingers to close around his large clay bead. She fought him a moment longer, then blinked up at his face, muzzy at first, and then angry. They sidled together over to the table and carefully sat down so she could replace her left hand for her right, free her right to finish her own talisman. The scratching of nib against paper. Their breath came white in the harsh, cold air. Zerina's left hand trembled against Zayd's fingers. If her right also shook, the charm would be less effective. So he stretched over for the abandoned fruit salad and fed his mother a slice of melon, sweet and calming. She sighed a little with relief. The window shutters rattled in their casements, and in the saint's room the door boomed and thundered with blows. Further away from their neighbours' buildings they began to hear brief screams. Zayd made to rise, to find his sword, and again the women's hands pulled him back down. "You don't fight demons with steel." His mother finished her amulet, sanded the ink dry, folded and rolled it, and placed it in the band of her headdress in the centre of her forehead. She looked at Zayd, braced herself, and let go of his necklace. Zayd and Jalla watched her narrowly, in case they might need to pin her again. Heartbeats passed, and then she sighed. "Nothing. I am myself. It's working." As they sagged with relief, long white fingers poked through the holes in the shutters and tore them, cracking and splintering off their iron hinges, tore the hinges out of the marble wall, reached inside and snatched. The dawn was not long coming. It only seemed like it. After they had shrieked together and retreated away from the finger's grasp, the creature outside had pushed itself flush to the wall and fished through the window with dirty, skinny arms. But it had not been able to come further in. When the door was likewise torn off, they could see a second creature try and try again to pass over the threshold, fail, and fail again. It did not make for a calm mood. But once they had got over the animal terror of it, they were able to sit huddled around the table, turn their backs on the threat, and with one hand on their talismans, the other on their books, they worked out the theory behind this square, came up with a new, stronger version. Zarina and Jala's squares, tested by each of them in turn, allowed use of both hands, and removed the need for constant concentration, restoring its wearer almost to normality. Zayd's did not work at all. "Well," he said, after they had tripped and sat on him, pressing one of the earlier charms to his forehead. "All these years and I have been selling worthless goods." "Your honoured father always maintained the squares had magic of their own," his mother reassured him, trying to soothe the domestic shame which added another layer of misery to one of the worst nights of his life. Who would have known he was wrong? "Perhaps we should have had a little less faith and done a little more testing. But we know now. Why don't you go through the books again and see if you can strengthen it further? And Jala and I will carry on and try to finish another 2 by the morning." So Zayd had his head down, a headache burning at the back of his eyes and his sight blurring as he worked on recombining letters and symbols in his notebook by the dim lantern light. Only when the sun rose high enough for its beam to fall through the window and spill across his work did he look up and discover they were alone. The monsters had gone. He touched his womenfolk on the hands, and they too put down their pens, rose blinking as though the night had lasted forever. Then his mother gave a brittle, brave smile and dashed her hands together. "I think this calls for something special for breakfast." Zayd smiled back, though he felt as though he had lain under a rock pile all night. "I must go and see if—" And a hammering began again at the door. His numbed spirits, which had taken the brief reprieve as an opportunity to revive, tumbled back into the pit. The breath caught in his throat, but he evaded Jala's catch at his wrist and sidled out from behind the harem's screen, edging cautiously into the saint's chamber. A dark shape, outlined by the sun, stood under the lintel. He peered but couldn't make it out. Then it stooped uninvited through the entrance and straightened up. In the gloom it looked just like a living man, a heavily bearded, snowy turbaned officer of the Janissaries, dark-skinned, dark-eyed, like a real person, who breathed even when he was not speaking. Outside, 2 short rows of soldiers stood with their sword hilts glinting, and waited at parade rest for whatever was happening now. Zayd wondered how he should ask the man for proof he was no demon. He was not offered the opportunity. "You are Zayd ibn Rabban? You will come with me. The Sultan, may he live forever, wishes to see you." Then Zayd remembered there were perils in the daytime also. "Of course," he said, bowing. "Let me just fetch an item I believe he will wish to see." He ducked back into the inner rooms and grabbed the small rug he had prepared for this eventuality. "I'm sorry. I don't want to leave you here alone after that, but when the Sultan calls, all must answer," his mother replied, with a thin but reassuring veneer of serenity. "You must go. We will stay here and make as many more amulets as we can." She handed him the first spare copy. "Give this to the Sultan. We do not know how far afield these demons may roam, and I could not live with myself if, turned away from us, they got to him instead." Zayd settled on a hug to give her all the thanks he couldn't say. "You are pearls among women, both of you. I should have thought of this." She patted his cheek, as though she had heard everything in his silence. "You would have done, but it doesn't hurt to be reminded." And then he couldn't think of anything more to delay it, so he put on coat and turban, followed the soldiers out into the day. There was no sign of the shifted and tumbled stones he had heard during the night. The graveyard lay peacefully asleep beneath its green boughs and flowers, every white stone in place. But as they passed the mausoleum where the family of Ali bin Daud lived, it struck him that it was too peaceful. He would expect the youngest boys to be trooping downhill to the Medress school, and the 2-year-old to be crying amid cooking smoke and the clatter of pans. "Wait!" He darted out from between his escort's neat lines and stuck his head through the tomb entrance. The whole family lay piled in the single chamber, sprawled in attitudes of sleep, but for the stark terror on their faces. Their open eyes had dried and sunk, and their lips drawn back from their teeth. Pale lips, pale, bloodless faces. Zayd recoiled with a shout of dismay, stood shivering and breathing hard while the soldiers too stuck their heads in to see. "More of them." The officer gave a jerky, dismissive shrug. His face was so professionally smooth, Zayd could not guess what he thought about this, even whether he thought at all. "More? You'll see." He did. The streets down which the soldiers marched him were choked with wailing mourners. The baker's was locked up tight, but outside, in the spot which he had occupied since Zayd was a boy, Keys, the baker, who had laughed at war, lay tumbled off his wheeled platform in the dirt, a single spot of blood blotching his chest, legless and undignified and abandoned in the dirt. By the time they reached Topkapi, Zayd's own personal fear was subsumed beneath layer after layer of concern for his city. He hardly felt it at all as he was ushered past the lines of weeping petitioners and straight into the great divan. There the air was scented with patchouli and nargileh smoke. The white and blue walls glowed in morning sunshine, cool and fresh as clean water. The great open sunlit space above the few men on the floor spoke of God's serenity, of his luminous peace, and the men who sat in it glowed like enamel in gorgeous colours and were speckled all over with fragments of pure light in the shape of jewels. It was as though he had passed through death and come out into paradise. At least, it was until Zayd looked up from his prostration and saw the cloth of gold slippers of the Sultan. Then his thoughts flashed back to the damp warmth of the caves, the memory that evil had reached even into this blessed house. What benefit offering the Sultan a protection from demons without, when he had plenty of his own inside? The Grand Mufti wore a green cloak that neither matched nor splendidly contrasted with his kaftan. The effect was of a man who had dressed in the dark and been too shaken to correct the mistake later. Zayd felt some affection for him because of it. "You have brought me a carpet." It astonished him that the Sultan still had time for carpets with the devastation outside. But why should it? The Lord of the Horizons could surely afford to pay attention to everything at once. "I have exulted." Perhaps there was room for personal fear after all. It made a valiant attempt to stop Zayd's mouth with lead, other things notwithstanding. But he unrolled the rug in the middle of the floor and sent up a quick prayer that no one would look too closely at the trick that was, he hoped, about to save his life. The rug had been hastily made by the cousin of one of Jala's friends. A black background, into which was woven the words Adam bin Adil, Zayd's recruit who could control sand, had chosen to activate his spell. The loose weave of the threads provided many small spaces to be filled with packed sand. "It's early days yet, but we've made some progress. Allow me to show you?" At the waved acknowledgement, he whispered the words of the spell, and the sand formed itself into 6 small zephyrs beneath the light rug, lifting it from the ground like a kite. It shook, stabilized, and then hovered a foot above the floor, the spinning sand beneath it fine enough to be barely visible, except in the form of a faint haze. The Sultan clapped his hands together and rose. I will stand on it. Yes, Most High. Zayd and Adam had tested this already, knew that it could be done, though carefully. He watched as white eunuchs came forward to support the Sultan under the arms, while he stepped onto the gauzy platform, helped him sink down to sit cross-legged in mid-air. It really did look as though it was flying. Zayd was impressed himself. He felt he had earned the murmurs of surprised admiration from some of the greatest men in the land. How do I make it go forward? That, Padishah, we have not yet discovered. I have people working on it as we speak. If I might have a few more weeks? A month, the Sultan ruled, giggling to himself as he looked down and savoured the fact that he was floating. Our infidel troops will take that long to fully arrive and organise themselves. You should be ready when they are. In the meantime, I am pleased. What would you have as a reward? Zayd tried not to breathe out in obvious relief, nor to press too hard on the little bump at his waist where the arsenic waited. Anointed One, he said instead. I was attacked last night in my home by a demon. When I passed through the city this morning, it seemed that I was not the only one. He smoothed down his jacket, and under it the parchment of the poor single charm he had brought. This was surely the time to hold it out, to give it to the Sultan, as was his clear duty. It was his absolute, unbending duty to beg Mahmud to protect himself. But he had remembered the angel, and he could not. These creatures seem unable to enter a man's home without his permission. Unfortunately, they are able to influence his mind to force that permission out of him. Last night my family and I made and tested a charm which protects the mind from the demon's influence. I entreat you for time to make enough copies to give one to each member of this divan. The Sultan turned so sharply toward Haji Nabi that he wobbled on his cushion of sandy air. We have an infestation of demons. We do, Exalted. I was going to raise it next. What is being done? Nothing as yet. The Sultan stepped off his carpet and went to roll it up. This being the sign that the sand should retreat into the weave, the whole thing fell to the floor, heavier and more solid than it had been while afloat. It rolled up like any normal carpet, none of the little particles escaping. Perfect. It had worked perfectly. If Zayd were not caught up in a war of guilt and reluctance, a disbelief of his own actions that made his body seem foreign to him, he would almost have been relieved. Nothing has been done, except by this man, who has been working on a solution before I had even been informed of the threat. Sultan Mahmud smiled, and some of Zayd's self-reproach eased. Mahmud had seemed better before it, as though he had shaken off his temporary madness and returned to deal with the world as a man. But this was not a human smile. While Zayd knew he should save Mahmud if it was possible to save him, his instincts told him he had come too late. Other people in this court deserved protection more. Nabi here has suggested we make you our archmage, Zayd ibn Rahman. An archmage can surely give us carpets and charms in the generous amount of time he has been given. You will solve this demon problem for us. The Sultan's smile widened, combining childish glee with deep malevolence to terrifying effect. Or you know what will happen to you next. That was chapters 13 and 14 of Sons of Devils, read by Galadir. The music was Gifts of Stars by Lloyd Rogers. Tune in next week to see what happens when all our heroes meet each other. Thanks for listening. See you then.